of the central bank and warfare model in those countries that are rebuilding themselves outside of that model, which will include the Scandinavian countries, perhaps Switzerland, certainly what's left of France after it goes through the riots and the disruptions of this coming year. As they rebuild, we may see a period where the government gets honest and starts offering people with gold to purchase the gold with real goods such that the government can have a store of gold to back their currencies. And thus gold will become more valuable but less in circulation. And it will cause a great alteration in the layout of who is powerful and who is not. And the powers that be, even though they have been in the process of hoarding gold and so forth, the revolutionary wave will separate many of them from these giant hoards of gold and will tend to redistribute it. However, there's 6.5 billion people on the planet. Our data expects that over 1 billion will die in the next few years, but nonetheless, that still leaves approximately 5 billion people on the planet and only 4 billion ounces of gold ever removed from the ground, and approximately half of those out of circulation. So gold will take on a particularly acute function in our global society as a storehouse representing the wealth of calories. Convoluted answer, I know, but that's the best we can do. I suspect most of it will really kick off for people outside the U.S. after November 4th of this year. End of statement.
Thank you, Clif. I'm completely with it. Most of us, all of us here, we understand you very well, and I know from astrology, from my comparisons to what happened before, that this makes sense. And now, go into this thing about the silver, because you had said that you would see via linguistics that silver could be so far more valuable compared to gold than gold is now, or than silver is now, meaning that the ratio between silver and gold will also change. Can you go into this a little bit more?
Yeah, we have a historical precedent for silver-gold relationships in almost all social orders that archaeologists have been able to get at. So, for instance, we know at the beginning of the Roman Empire that silver and gold occupied a 1 ounce of gold could buy you 4 ounces of silver when things started rolling. As the empire expanded and silver became a little bit more plentiful, it started going up to 1 to 8, eventually reached 1 to 15, where it hovered for a number of centuries, and then through debasement went to a 1 to 30. We know, for instance, at the moment that priced in dollars, using the illusionary paper ETFs and everything, there's approximately a 1 to 70 relationship between gold and silver, and that the silver is maligned, so to speak, that actual physical stores of the silver become more valuable as we discover how little silver there is. Now, this is a curious part of our data, because gold, even though it has some industrial applications and is somewhat used up in the process of making computers and even cell phones, silver, on the other hand, has a whole lot of industrial applications. Much of it is actually consumed and in a non-recoverable form. But our data seems to show that there is a new future for silver, and that part of that will be associated with some of the discoveries that come out in November, December relative to the new electrics. It would appear that silver will become a vital material to be used in the restraining, if you will, of energy for the new electrics. So it may be that there is some capacity for silver to store huge amounts of electricity in a silver atom that then could be stored in copper or any other form of atom outside of the crystals. Now, I bring that up because we see that after November of 2010, there's another major change for silver, and it drops from this highly prized area, and it is replaced industrially by the discovery or the perfection of a process where we get hold of this crystalline material that will come from the far north, be melded to an understanding that will arise out of South Africa and South America, and we'll be able to use these crystals to store energy at huge levels in minute quantities, and thereafter silver will simply become a currency. But between now and then, we will probably actually see some pressure on the price of silver based on its ability to facilitate electrical stuff. So it may become more prized as this particular industrial material than as a storehouse of wealth, even though it will occupy both at the same time. And this is part of the process whereby this 1 to 70 relationship will be severed and will probably at one point drop down to, if not 1 to 1, then at least 1 to 3. But that is only brief, and it'll be temporary, and it'll be in the midst of the dollar chaos. So attempting to time that kind of thing doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Plus, anybody that's attempting to do that kind of timing is still trapped in the idea that they can, quote, gather wealth just by being really smart that way. And we have to start thinking differently. End of statement.
Got it. Okay, got it. That was well said. We're smiling here. Now on to a new set of 3 questions coming from Japan from my friend Ruben, who is doing the video about my other work. He asked you the following 3 questions. So I read you the first. It is my understanding that the true nature of the changes is unpredictable and that some geographical locations seem more vulnerable than others. I see, as does Lady No Eyes or Edgar Cayce and many others, that the Japanese archipelago will be strongly affected, but at the same time much better prepared internally to these coming changes. How will countries like Japan and Bolivia, Nepal fare during this transformative period? End of first question.
I'm of the opinion that the hang on a second. Let me see what the dog's doing. Sophie, it's okay. It's okay, sweetie. No, guys. They're upset about something, but as long as they're barking, it's not really anything more than their own figments of their imagination. Hang on just a second. Hey, quiet. Anyway, Japan is a particular subject of some concern to me because I have ties to it through the Aikido, and its situation is not good. It sits right on a very particular level of ridges within the Ring of Fire. If it is lucky, it won't sink any further than it really already has. We have to understand that much of Japan is already underwater. The actual country may be 5 or 6 times what is currently occupied based on the undersea monuments. So leaving Japan aside for a second, let's look at the elevated regions. Nepal and Bolivia, I don't expect to see much in the way of change at all. Those areas have gone through this in a previous occurrence. And so, for instance, we know that the archaeology around Lake Titicaca in the Altiplano suggests that it was a seaport that was raised up from a sea level to about 11,000 feet over the course of approximately 7 days with much loss of structure and life. Bolivia came along to a lesser extent during that period of time. Those areas, given the fact that any continent can simply collapse, any continent is basically just floating on top of it's a bunch of dirt that's accumulated on top of some very large rocks. These very large rocks are the crustal plates, but they're just floating, so to speak, and they're not solid. They're not interconnected. They can break up and sink at any given time based on what's going on. Our data suggests that we're going to go through some fairly large earth changes, the level of which is entirely unknowable, and we only have little tiny hints. Those little hints we get seem to suggest that there will be areas that will have another lifting event. And we may indeed see such strangeness as the west coast of the U.S. rising up another Andean-style altiplano that makes the Rocky Mountains look small. During that period of time, there is some suggestion that in the last time this occurred, a very large landmass sank. That landmass was south of India in the Great Southern Ocean, and it apparently just sank below several thousand feet of water during this last giant upheaval. Now, let's stop for a second and look at some of the other data that seems to suggest that this time through the changes will be less horrific from a human viewpoint than previous times. So we may indeed get giant floods, but the data so far seems to suggest that the floods will not be the type that will scrub whole continents clean. We also have another issue relative to Japan and coastlines in particular. and that is that the overall, in spite of the water levels rising globally with the melt and so on, there seems to be both evidence in manifesting reality as well as evidence or suggestions within our data that almost all the coastlines are going to go through at least some level of a rising event. The only way I can reconcile this is to accept the idea of a plasma model for the planet. And that is to say that the model is that there's no molten core in the middle of the Earth because a molten core of iron cannot hold magnetism and cannot generate magnetism no matter how much it spins. And so the only molten anything that could generate the level of magnetic field we have now would be a giant plasma reaction, which makes sense because matter has to come from somewhere. The E equals mc squared equation is actually a circular reference. As energy is created in universe, it also has to create matter, otherwise the universe would be manifestly completely 100% filled with energy. And we know that's not the case, that energy comes into existence, things happen in the material world, and matter is shoved around, including created. And so if that's the case, then Japan may fare better than we would expect otherwise, simply because the whole of the Earth is expanding and is going to grow a little bit larger. And because it's going to grow a little bit larger, we're going to have these unsettling Earth changes, and perhaps even have some sinking areas as the skin of the orange of the Earth, so to speak, pulls apart to accommodate the larger amount of matter in the middle of it. But that'll also drain some of the ocean levels. So, for instance, our stuff on the coasts could be taken to be interpreted either way. That there are going to be tidal influences that cause humans problems, but those tidal influences could be that the tides recede, and thus all of our ports may become inland bases of some 2 or 3 or 4 miles, depending on how much actual recession occurs. Does that make sense?
Yes. Can I give you first another one also coming from the same friend in Japan related to wing makers, blank slate technology, etc. And then I want to go for one more round of additional follow-up questions that came. So that second question from Japan is, quote, the following. You mentioned before that Cuba and Siberia will have much to offer to the international community during the coming changes, as it has been doing for such a long time with its doctors to many developing countries. Do you see other countries, regions, or communities playing a more active role in disseminating some kind of advanced knowledge?
Yes, we do. Curiously, there will be a resurgence of intellect or a brilliance that will come out of Africa. At this point, because our modeling of languages really focuses on South Africa, where we have English to go into, mostly I do not have the African languages modeled. They're a little bit more difficult to deal with than, say, Russian or something. So I have a tendency to concentrate on South Africa, but it is used as a proxy for all of Africa. So for whatever reason, there's going to be a very brilliant individual or collection of individuals that will come out of Africa that will make this joining between Siberia and Canada. And it will make the joining between the knowledge and resources of Siberia and some resources yet undiscovered in Canada. And this will form a triangulation, if you will, that seemingly